All right. Well, good afternoon. It's afternoon now. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Elliot Williams, and I'm the training manager at the National Press Club Journalism Institute. Just want to say thank you for spending your time with us this Thursday. A few things to note before we begin. We are recording this program, and highlights will appear on our website and in our daily newsletter for journalists called The Latest, which you can subscribe to using the link in our chat. Today, we are joined by the Bipartisan Policy Center, a nonprofit organization that identifies and drives policy solutions through analysis, negotiation, and dialogue between leaders from both political parties. The BPC's work spans economics, energy, housing, labor, health, and more. On the governance and election side specifically, BPC works to strengthen public trust in elections and ensure fully funded, secure, and continually improved election systems. And today we're talking about the ongoing high stakes midterm elections. Before we dig in, let me introduce our guest speaker. Wren Orey is an expert elections researcher and director of BPC's Elections Project. Orey oversees BPC's election administration policy and researches reforms to improve the security, accessibility, and trustworthiness of elections. They serve as an adjunct professor of computer programming at Georgetown Law, and they've been an expert source for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Politico, and more. Today, with Wren's help, we'll focus on changes in voter list maintenance and what they mean for election coverage, trends among the election workforce, and how to cover the midterm elections in a way that cuts through the noise. We've asked that you remain respectful of others in this group in the chat and the time we're sharing this afternoon. Feel free to submit questions using the chat or our Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and your questions will be addressed after Wren's presentation. And again, let us know where you're tuning in from. I see many of you have already done that. And now I'd like to turn things over to our elections expert in the room, Wren.
Hey everyone, really good to see you. As a kind of note of context, I am tuning in from a conference of local election officials in Chicago. So I'm on some somewhat unreliable hotel Wi-Fi. So please let me know if I cut out at any point. But I'm going to spend some time today walking through the election administration landscape going into the midterms. To give you a little bit of context about who I am and the team that I'm part of. So I manage the Elections Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and our goal at the Elections Project is to develop and advance durable bipartisan policy solutions to create secure, accessible, and trustworthy elections. We do that primarily by partnering directly with election officials to develop practitioner-informed, pragmatic policy solutions. We really see election officials as the key stakeholder when it comes to crafting strong policy because they're the ones who know best what policy works and what doesn't. And they're the ones on the front line working with voters day in and day out throughout the election season. We then take those policy solutions that we develop with election officials and advance them through state and federal advocacy. We also do a lot of work partnering directly with state associations of local election officials, trying to position them as the key drivers of change within states. So, long story short, we do a lot of work developing policy with election officials and then helping them move it forward. We also do some public-facing work, so I'll be covering a lot of our public products today that you can find on our website. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So some of the topics that I'll cover in my presentation today are one, what you need to know about the election workforce, two, where we are when it comes to the federal policy landscape. So speaking to the Save America Act, as well as the president's recent executive order. And then finally, doing a deep dive on non-citizen voting and registration. This has been kind of, one of the most salient topics in elections the last few years, and we've done quite a bit of work looking at list maintenance, a documentary proof of citizenship requirements, and how those impact both voters and election administrators. So first, I always think it's helpful when covering election administration to know a little bit about the workforce that comprises this field, because it can be a little difficult to cover elections given just how complex and decentralized they are. Elections are administered at the state, local, even municipal level all around the country. And so trying to kind of cover that from a bird's eye view can be really difficult, given the like just sheer complexity of that system. So zooming out a little bit, there are about 10,000 chief election officials around the country. Those are the county clerks, the municipal clerks. Those ones are the kind of those overseeing the local election offices that are responsible for the kind of day-to-day responsibilities of voter registration, of identifying polling places, of maintaining equipment. Um, there are also, those are at the local level. And then, of course, there are state chief election officials, typically secretaries of state, that have varying levels of responsibility around the country. Some are very involved in the day-to-day of election administration, and some are a little bit more hands-off, leaving more authority to the locals. Those chief election officials are supported by roughly 25,000 full-time staff. Those are those people in the offices who are supporting election officials. And then typically when in federal election years, there are about 900,000 temporary election workers. So typically poll workers, election judges who are also helping elections be carried out. So from my perspective, the workforce is one of the most important parts of election administration. Because of the decentralization, local election officials often have a lot of authority. And so it's these individuals that are important to be coordinating with when covering election events. So these individuals are broadly responsible for voter registration, vote casting, counting, and results reporting. There's a wide variety in office size and policies. I think this is the part where it can sometimes get confusing because one county might do a process very different from the county next to it. So it can make like covering topics a little bit challenging. The typical local election official, this is research done by the Elections and Voting Information Center out of Portland State University. They find that the kind of most common local election official is a white woman in her mid-50s with a college degree, earning just over $50,000 a year. So if you're reaching out to election officials in an election season, that's kind of most likely who you'd be running into. Most election officials run very small offices. So I think this is one of the most important parts of understanding election administration is that those big jurisdictions, the Maricopa counties, the Fulton counties, they are not the norm. They comprise a very small portion of local election officials serving large numbers of voters. So in other words, this is, again, research done by the Elections and Voting Information Center. And they find that 75% of local election officials serve just 8% of voters. That means that those are very, very small offices all around the country. So these like quite rural counties where there might be one individual who is a county clerk who is running elections alongside a variety of other duties. And so they're the ones serving a very small portion of voters. And then conversely, just 8% of local election officials. So these are the like LA County, the Fulton County, the Maricopa County. Those serve 75% of voters in those bigger jurisdictions. So it does create some nuance in how we reach out to and serve those election officials. So like I said, local election officials often have a lot of authority due to the decentralization of elections, which means that when there's turnover among chief local election officials, it can have a pretty damaging impact on that jurisdiction's ability to run good elections, because it is often that that individual has a lot of institutional knowledge and experience that they've gained in their time on the job. And when they leave, it can be difficult for the new person coming in, especially if it's an office with only one person, to learn the ropes. So in order to better understand the challenges facing the election workforce, we did some research looking into how local election official turnover has changed over time. And we found that local election official turnover reached its highest level on record in 2024. It has been rising steadily for over 2 decades and then peaked in 2024. And we don't yet have data on whether it will continue to rise or whether it will begin to go down. I think there are a few takeaways from this research. One is that going into or coming out of 2020, there was some speculation that the new stressors facing the election workforce after 2020 might cause a spike in turnover that previously didn't exist. I think what we learned is that the challenges facing election officials in 2020 were more severe, but they weren't new. The rising turnover over time, this kind of slow and steady churn that has been increasing in severity, to me speaks to the chronic underfunding of election administration and the impact of technology on local election offices. There has been kind of increasing complexity and responsibilities put on their plates without a commensurate increase in resources. And so that is kind of driving this slow, gradual increase in turnover, and speaks to the need to address like deep workforce stressors that are facing election officials and not just respond to current crises. Despite high turnover, though, election officials continue to have long records of experience. I don't want the takeaway from this research to be that we are doomed. In fact, the 2024 EVIC survey of local election officials found that the average election official has 7 years of experience in their current position and 11 years of total experience in the field. We also looked more deeply at officials who are new to their role and found that about 60% of new election officials have prior professional experience in elections, and about 80% have experience in government. So despite the high turnover, we do find that new officials have some experience to prepare them for the role. Shifting gears a little bit away from workforce into the current federal landscape. So we find that I'm going to dive into election bills under consideration by Congress. So kind of looking at the major pieces of legislation that have been kind of in conversation in the last few years. So first, I think it's helpful to note that the SAVE Act is not new. So it was actually first introduced in May of 2024, and it was passed in the House in both the last and the current Congress. So it's been a kind of part of dialogue for a long time. Introduced the Save America Act, which is an expanded version of the SAVE Act that was first introduced in January of this year. And this is the bill that has been the major focus of Trump advocacy in recent months. So it was passed by the House in February, and just this week stalled in the Senate. And it is sort of the general takeaway is that it's probably officially doomed, but you never know what could happen. And then finally, the MEGA Act is another piece of elections legislation, the Make Elections Great Again Act. And that was first introduced in the House in January of 2026. It is not a major focus at the moment, but I do think it's a helpful indication of Republican lawmakers' election policy interest. So when it comes to what is in these different pieces of legislation, the through line between the three bills is a requirement that voters provide documentary proof of U.S. citizenship in order to register to vote. I'll spend a little bit more time about what that means and how it impacts voters momentarily. Some things that are in the Save America Act that were not in the SAVE Act include requiring voters to provide a photo ID to cast a ballot and mandating use of the USCIS SAFE system. That's a federal system that allows state, local, and federal agencies to check the citizenship and immigration status of individuals. So those are in the other two bills and not in the SAVE Act. And then the MEGA Act, like I said, sort of not a big priority, but a helpful indication of policy priorities, has a bunch of other provisions in it as well. So the MEGA Act would ban universal mail voting. That's when an election office sends a mail ballot to all registered voters, even when they haven't requested one. It would require mail ballots be received by election day to be counted. It would require election officials to process mail ballots upon receipt, but delay tabulation until polls close. And it would require voting systems to use voter verifiable paper ballots, among other changes to voting technology. So these are just some of the many other provisions that are in the MEGA Act that may kind of get picked up in other pieces of legislation that Congress considers this year or next. So now shifting gears to look a little bit more deeply at the documentary proof of citizenship and non-citizen voting conversation. Some quick facts that I find helpful in navigating these conversations. First, non-citizen voting and registration is already illegal and is very rare. So data suggests that less than 0.04% of registered voters are non-citizens. And this is data from the current Trump administration's USCIS SAFE system. Last August, there was a FOIA request filed by the ACLU that led to the kind of public release of aggregate data on SAFE system transactions for voter verification cases. So this is aggregate data on how all of the voter verification cases that had been processed to date, what it resulted in. And this shows that 96.3% of cases submitted by election offices for citizenship verification were returned confidently as U.S. citizen. A little over 3%, SAVE was not able to verify and needed additional information or verification in order to return a response. About 0.5% were returned as having been deceased, and 0.04% were returned as non-US citizens. So this is federal data on current voter records showing that at present, non-citizen registration is extremely, extremely rare. We find that state-conducted audits of voter registration lists kind of echo the same numbers. So Utah, for example, began a citizenship audit of its entire voter roll last August. More than 99.9% were verified as US citizens. In this audit that took them kind of months to do, processing thousands and thousands of voter registration records, they found just one confirmed non-citizen and who had never voted and was since removed from the list. And then as of January, they had some context out about their audit and were continuing to investigate 486 individuals who were pending outreach. Those were individuals that the SAVE system had an inconclusive response for and wasn't able to verify. And they are conducting outreach to those individuals and awaiting a response. But initial evidence suggests that those are individuals who had registered before a social security number or driver's license are required. So it makes sense that they wouldn't be able to find citizenship information in federal records because they just don't have the types of identifiers they would need to look them up. So it's my guess is that most of these individuals are not going to end up being non-citizens. Additionally, Real ID does not equal proof of citizenship. So there's this kind of misconception that a documentary proof of citizenship requirement might be easy for most people if they have a Real ID. But you can actually get a Real ID if you are a lawful permanent resident, for example. You have to provide proof of lawful status, but you do not have to provide proof of citizenship. So there are about 6 states where they have what's called an enhanced Real ID that it is considered proof of citizenship, but by and large, for most Americans, that ID alone is not going to be enough. Birth certificates would kind of be the fallback, but even birth certificates alone may not satisfy Save America Act requirements. The Save America Act says that if you use a birth certificate, you also have to supply a photo ID. So that's now 2 pieces of documentation that you use. And it also has some pretty strict requirements about your birth certificate having a official seal and having the full name of one or both parents, and just a few additional requirements that might weed out some birth certificates from the general public. There are about 14,000 different types of birth certificates in circulation. So I don't have exact stats on how many of those meet the requirements, but my guess is many of them would not. I also think it's worth noting that there's a better way to do citizenship verification than requiring that voters bring a piece of paper that they might not have in order to register to vote, and that's back-end verification. So using something like the USCIS SAVE system or using other government data that already exists to affirm the citizenship status of voters, thereby putting the responsibility for citizenship verification on government bodies who already have a lot of this information rather than on voters themselves. So diving a little bit more into the impact on voters. So we did some analysis a month or 2 ago looking at data collected by the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. And we tried to dive into this question of whether documentary proof of citizenship requirements disadvantage one party more than the other. And this is a piece that is available on our website. It doesn't only cover the impact on different parties, it also covers the impact on different demographic groups. So we find that overall, about 12% of registered voters lack common forms of documentary proof. So the most common types of documents that individuals would provide under the Save America Act or other DPOC requirements would be a passport, which on its own is a proof of citizenship that is valid, or a birth certificate and ID. You would have to have both under the Save America Act requirements. And we found that a little less than half of Americans have a passport that is valid in their current legal name, and about 80% report having both a birth certificate and a photo ID. About 88% say they have one or the other. So in other words, that means about 12% of the American public might not be able to supply the types of documents that would be needed in order to register to vote under a DPOC requirement. And about the same proportion of Democrats and Republicans lack common forms of documentary proof. So kind of 89, 90% of Democrats and Republicans report having these types of documents. But what I think is interesting is that Democrats are far more likely to rely on a passport, while Republicans are more likely to rely on a birth certificate and ID. So that indicates that given the challenges of birth certificates when it comes to meeting the strict requirements of the SAVE Act, Republicans may ultimately be more disadvantaged by documentary proof of citizenship requirements, just because birth certificates are a less reliable form of documentary proof. Not only do they also require an ID, but they might be not in your current name if you've changed your name. They also might not meet these stricter requirements. So that's kind of the down low on documentary proof of citizenship. Happy to talk more about that in more specificity later. One more piece of the federal landscape is a recent executive order. So last month, the Trump administration issued a second executive order on elections. They had issued an executive order in March of last year as well. The executive order is very likely to be enjoined. That means kind of held by courts and not enforceable. But I still think it's worth discussing for a few reasons. One, I think it's helpful that we are able to explain why the provisions were not implementable in their current form, to the extent that it is that voters or other individuals are questioning why election officials weren't able to meet the requirements. And I also think it's helpful for election officials to be able to explain the activities they're already doing to meet the intended outcome of the executive order. So that's the approach that we take in a piece that we put out a couple weeks ago on what is in the new executive order on elections. You can take a look at it on our website if you would like to read it in more detail. I'm going to focus on two of the major sections of the executive order here. So first, Section 3 of the executive order involves the USPIS or the USPS in verifying voter eligibility. It directs USPS to establish rulemaking that would require states to submit to USPS a list of eligible male voters 60 days before an election. And then it would forbid USPS from transmitting a mail ballot from anyone not on that list. It also requires USPS to provide states with a list of voters who are enrolled with USPS for mail-in or absentee ballots, and also requires states to use intelligent mail barcodes for ballot mail. All of this seems somewhat reasonable on its surface, but there are some challenges to implementation given the way election administration is currently structured. So the lists provided to USPS by states or locals will be essentially guaranteed to be incomplete. So like I said, it would require states to submit a list 60 days before the election. And that's a list of voters who are eligible to vote by mail. However, the deadline to request a mail ballot is within 60 days of an election in every state and territory. That means a state would submit a list at 60 days before an election, but voters could continue to request a mail ballot after, meaning that anyone who requests that mail ballot after the deadline would not be on the original list, and the state would have to reach out to USPS to get them added. And there's no existing mechanism to do either of those things. Federal law also says that the maximum voter registration deadline is 30 days before an election. So that means in every state and territory, voters can continue to register up until 30 days before the election, again, creating that risk that individuals just aren't going to be on the list. Additionally, the relationship between the two lists is not clear. So it's not clear what it means to be enrolled with the USPS or what states are supposed to do with the list provided to them by the USPS. So just sort of a lot of confusion and chaos potentially created by trying to merge all of these lists together in an unclear fashion. I'm also just going to kind of speed through this next bit, but it's too late for jurisdictions to make changes to mail ballot envelope design. A lot of jurisdictions have already printed their ballot envelopes for the year, so trying to make changes at this point is just too late. Similarly, trying to get federal agencies to do something is inherently time consuming, and the election is coming up, and the deadline created by the executive order of 120 days is very ambitious and would only give states 37 days to submit their required list and meet the requirements of the order. So if we zoom out a little bit, the intended outcome of this seems to be to ensure that mail ballots are sent only and returned by eligible voters. There are a few things that election officials are already doing to achieve this goal. They maintain lists of voters eligible to vote by mail. They track those individuals. If a voter submits multiple ballots or attempts to vote in person after mailing one, only one ballot counts. They have systems to ensure that every individual can only submit one ballot, and then any suspicious activity is flagged for investigation. 44 states do have ways to ensure that the individual who sent a mail ballot is actually that person, typically through a process known as signature verification. There are also other ways that other states confirm the identity of mail ballot deliverers. And also the vast majority of states do mail ballot tracking already, which is something that the executive order tried to expand. So election officials are already taking steps to secure mail voting. Mail voting is safe and secure. And what the executive order does would kind of confuse and cause chaos on top of these existing processes. Additionally, the executive order attempts to direct DHS and the Social Security Administration to compile and transmit to each state a list of individuals who are confirmed to be U.S. citizens, but it does not direct states to do anything with these lists. So if you're keeping track of where we've gotten so far, this is now a third list. We had two lists involved with USPS and now a third list about citizenship, and the executive order doesn't specify how those lists are supposed to relate to each other. And also doesn't tell states to do anything with the lists that they're receiving from DHS. So there are some challenges with the creation of state citizenship lists. The federal government doesn't have data on residents. So it says that DHS has to send each state a list of citizens, but the federal government has no way to know accurately who lives in what state. So the lists are almost guaranteed to be inaccurate. Additionally, they can't be used to find and remove non-citizens because there are known gaps in federal data on citizenship. Like, for example, individuals who are born out of the country, individuals who are recently naturalized. So this information can't be used to remove non-citizens. And finally, voter rolls may not have sufficient information to match with state citizenship lists. Typically, voter rolls have a driver's license number. Sometimes they have a social security number. Federal agencies do not typically have driver's license numbers. So there's just an inherent mismatch between the two lists. And it would be really hard for states to accurately join their voter record with the information that they're receiving from the federal government. So the intended outcome of this state citizenship list is to prevent voting and registration by non-citizens. In wrapping up here, I'll just offer a little bit of what election officials are already doing to achieve this goal. So federal law requires that states verify citizenship at the point of registration by requiring voters to attest under penalty of perjury that they are a U.S. citizen. Additionally, at least 23 states currently have agreements with USCIS to use its SAVE system to verify the citizenship status of voter registration applicants. Additionally, a lot of election officials rely on other government data. So, for example, jury summons where someone has said they are not a citizen, or just the types of documents that you use when getting a driver's license. A lot of individuals provide that documentation when they are doing a DMV transaction, and election offices can use that information to verify citizenship for many applicants. A little bit more on the USCIS SAVE system before we wrap up. So SAVE is operated by DHS, by USCIS, which is within DHS. And it's an online service that provides citizenship status information to government agencies. It's been around for several decades, but some changes made last year made it more accessible to election offices. First, it was expanded to include natural-born citizens. Previously, it only had those with acquired citizenship, for example, those with who were a permanent resident or who had naturalized. So this allowed election offices to confirm citizenship for the vast majority of voters who are natural-born. It also permitted a voter lookup with a social security number or last four of a social. Previously, it had to be a unique immigration identifier that few, if any, election officials had on record for voters. It also allowed election offices to submit bulk requests all at once rather than going one by one and having to pay for those requests. So the federal government has long resisted creating a centralized population registry. This has been a long, well-documented part of US culture. And so I think there are some important privacy and accuracy considerations to think about when it comes to comparing something like the state citizenship list that the executive order mandates to the use of a query-based system that exists within SAVE. So with SAVE, there's no one place where all of this data lives. Rather, it's spread out across various government agencies that each maintain authority over the data that they own. So for example, states retain control of their voter registration lists. The Social Security Administration retains control over data on natural-born citizens. DHS retains control over data on naturalized citizens. So in this way, it better respects this culture of privacy because sensitive information is not centralized, but it's dispersed across agencies, and no one agency has to surrender its records in totality. Each agency instead responds to disparate requests. So we generally are in support of the USCIS SAVE system and have some recommendations on our website on how it could be more improved to serve voters and election officials. And wrapping up here today, we have a lot of resources on our website. So we have an election resource hub that includes a lot of our kind of more general content about voting and elections. You can take a look at that. I think they're going to put a link in the chat. We also have a piece I want to draw your attention to called United in Security, How Every State Protects Your Vote. So like I mentioned at the beginning, elections are very decentralized. They work differently in different places around the country. What this piece does is it identifies some of the common threads that every state, every jurisdiction does to protect election security, to protect voter access. So if you want things that you can point to help explain why our elections are secure, why our results are legitimate, you can take a look at this document. It's 2 pages. It is sort of just like a helpful repository of resources to explain why our elections are secure and trustworthy. So thank you. You can find my contact info here. You can find our website here. Look in the chat for all of our resources and happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful, Wren. Thank you so much. That was very comprehensive and really helpful. We're going to get into some questions here, and just a reminder that you can submit those through our Q&A function. We already had a few questions come in, so I'll just jump right in. Well, someone wants to know if driver's licenses that are Real ID compliant, all but a couple of states, are they sufficient as the photo ID piece of the identification required?
Yes, yes. So they would be sufficient for the photo ID, and then they would just also have to provide proof of citizenship. The way I like to think about it is like the photo ID is proof of identity. That's proof that you are who you say you are. The proof of citizenship is proof that you're a citizen, and you kind of need both to put a comprehensive picture together.
Got you. And then someone wants to know if you have any reports or hard info statistics as to why mail-in voting takes longer in some jurisdictions over others. Is it the counting, kind of what goes into that?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I'll find a link and put it in the chat in a minute. MIT recently did a really great report on that question. But there are a few things that impact and I think what you're referring to is the amount of time it takes to tabulate results from mail ballots rather than other parts of mail voting. And I think one of the things that impacts it is when voters return their mail ballots. So there's a lot of focus right now on the postmark deadline. So whether or not an election office can continue to count mail ballots that are received after election day. That is actually a very small proportion of mail ballots and hasn't been found to meaningfully impact the speed of results reporting. Things that tend to matter more are like in Maricopa County, they tend to have hundreds of thousands of voters dropping off a mail ballot in an envelope on election day at a vote center. So that vote center now has to take those thousands of mail ballots, take them back to the central count facility, verify the signatures, open the envelope, flatten the ballots, scan them in. So even though they were received on election day, that is a huge amount of work that can take, days after election day to continue to process. So there are small things like that that impact it. Also, the just margin of victory is a big factor anytime we're looking at the speed of media outlets' ability to call election outcomes. So if it's very narrow and you're relying on a small portion of mail ballots that are still being processed, that can mean that it takes more time to figure out who won that election.
Definitely. Someone is attempting to cover elections at the county level, but has been unable to watch the count or get access under stated security concerns. Are there any strategies you recommend to covering that count even with those restrictions?
So you're asking if you like trying to be there present watching the count take place. I'm not sure I'm following.
I think this question is around yeah, covering the count and being there if there are security concerns in person. That's how I'm understanding the question as
Mhm.
stated.
Yeah. Different states and local jurisdictions have different observer protocols. So my suggestion would be to get in touch with the local election office well ahead of election day to try to understand what their observation policies are. Some of the larger jurisdictions, like I spent some time in Maricopa County in 2024, and they have a full dedicated space for media, and they're giving updates. They have more transparency, but a lot of the smaller local offices don't have the resources to support that level of engagement. But many of them do have observer policies where you could come observe the voting or tabulation process. So I would just get in touch with them ahead of election day when they have time to talk with you and engage with you, build that relationship, and figure out what you can and can't see when it comes to counting.
Along those lines, you said some pretty interesting statistics that, 8% of elections officials serve 75% of voters. I imagine these are overwhelmed, overworked officials. As a member of the press, who, maybe these workers in some cases are wary of speaking to journalists, what have you seen be successful in terms of covering stories on elections through election officials? If you're trying to get in touch with an office that maybe not in Maricopa County, but in a place where they're a little bit more overwhelmed, what strategies have you seen work in terms of making that connection?
I think the most important thing is to first build a relationship with a local election official when it isn't a peak election season. If the first time an election office is hearing from you is in the middle of voting, they're going to be a little bit stressed, a little overwhelmed. They probably spent all day getting yelled at by voters, getting asked questions by voters, trying to manage whatever crises are coming up. And if they're hearing from you the first time, they just might be a little bit more reticent to engage. So if you can spend some time now, reaching out to them, building that relationship, it's going to make it a lot better once you reach out to them during when something is actually happening.
And just a follow up there, are there specific questions that reporters should be asking and editors like right now, or if they're trying to build that relationship that doesn't overwhelm them even now? Are there things about like what issues are you seeing? What are some of your concerns, like things that they can be asking now?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think asking election officials what they're worried about if you're kind of planning potential coverage around the election, asking them how they like what their preferred way to be reached out to is if something were to happen. I think there's also like depending on the type of story that you're writing, collecting information ahead of time about the policies in place. So you don't have to start from scratch. So, for example, if you anticipate covering election night reporting, asking an election official ahead of time what results they tend to publish first, if those are the mail ballots, if those are the in-person ballots, asking them when they plan to post them, kind of just like doing a lot of the work ahead of time so that when you're reaching out on election day, it's really only for those like urgent emerging questions that you could not have answered before.
That makes sense. Also, as you were talking, I was noting that you mentioned, there are 14,000 types of birth certificates, and 12% of registered voters lack common forms of documented, proof. So I'm thinking like in terms of format for a story, right? Like there are guides, there are more narrative structures. Someone wants to know what information about access to voting tends to break through to audiences. If you're thinking about what kind of story you want to tell, what actually reaches audiences and resonates with them in a way that helps them and doesn't cause more chaos.
Yeah, that's a good question. I could almost flip it back on the view because you're the one who's actually talking to the general public. I talk a lot to policy audiences and election officials, but some insight that I have on that from other research I've seen or experience doing our own reporting on this as well. It can be, I think, tempting to go for the crisis angle. And I think the challenge of framing everything as a crisis is that it doesn't respect the preparation that election officials have done for a lot of these emergent scenarios or crisis moments. And I think one way to get around that is having the more like human focused angle. There's been some research done that shows that emphasizing that election officials are your neighbors and community members are sort of like helpful ways to ground a story in what like protections election officials are doing and humanize it a little bit. So if you are like kind of looking for a way to take a trust and security angle, maybe focusing it on that local election official and their role in the process and who they are as a person can lead to readers having higher trust in the election process than stories that are more focused on like process or very like nitty gritty administrative things that might be like a bit of a turnoff.
It always helps to show that these are real people behind all of this.
Mhm.
We have a question around mail-in ballots. Considering that rural voters comprise a significant portion of the Republican base and are also a significant part of the mail-in voting pool, are are you seeing any sort of like this person's wondering what benefits maybe the current administration sees in restricting this kind of voting, or at least have they stated any benefits? Just trying to get into the why of all of this.
Yeah, so the usage rates of mail voting has kind of changed quite a bit over the last few decades. When mail voting first sort of started picking up in popularity, it was used relatively evenly between Democrats and Republicans. What we saw was that after 2020, once like people started focusing on mail voting as a potential security risk, we saw it split. So now we have this environment where Democrats are slightly more likely to use mail voting than Republicans, but it's really quite slight. It's a difference of a couple percentage points, and Republicans continue to use mail voting regularly. And we do find that the pullback on mail voting is very likely to impact rural voters the hardest. So there's a lot of dialogue right now about that postmark deadline for mail ballots. There's also been some USPS kind of processing changes to how they process mail. That might mean that mail isn't returned as quickly to a local election office. So if you were to have a requirement that ballots be received by election day in order to be counted, and a rural voter is returning their mail ballot even a week ahead of time, it's possible that that mail ballot doesn't make it back to the local election official by the close of polls. And so it's just kind of by nature of how USPS operates that those ballots take longer to be returned and are therefore more likely to impact rural voters. And so I think that is just sort of a nature of the problem, and it isn't necessarily like I don't think rolling back mail voting would give Republicans an edge. I think it would very likely impact both parties and potentially impact one party more than the other. Someone asked earlier about why some um, like the states take longer to process mail ballots than others. And I wanted to
Yeah.
just show, I found a presentation that I put together a couple months ago on this. And I wanted to show a report from MIT that looked at pre-processing mail ballot usage and vote reporting. So they find that higher mail ballot usage is modestly associated with slower reporting. So this is like 4 hours after election day, 12 hours and 2 days after. And that pre-processing, that's like processing those ballots as they're arriving before election day, leads to faster reporting right after polls close. But then that advantage kind of goes away within about 12 hours. And then on this question of postmarked like receipt deadlines. So if you have to have all ballots received on election day in order to be counted, that's that sort of like yellow line. And if you can continue to receive them after election day, that's the blue line. Um, you'll see that like overall, having a deadline on election day leads to slightly more results reported than those received after election day. But when you actually control for other factors, this result is no longer statistically significant. So I think my main takeaway is that there are a lot of factors that impact the speed of results reporting, and postmark deadlines are one of them, but is not like the driving factor in this conversation.
That's very helpful. And thank you for pulling up that presentation so fast. We're getting another question around the mail-in ballots. What do you attribute the frequent discovery of ballots that seem to happen either late in the vote count or during recounts or litigation? We always see those headlines of like, ballots discovered. What is that referring to?
I think that is probably poor coverage, to be honest. I
Mm.
think it's not ballots being discovered late in the process. I think like different jurisdictions take different approaches to when they process different types of ballots. So, typically you might see a jurisdiction that reports initial results, and those would be the results that are from election day. So, like if you have a voting location on election day, a voter is scanning their ballot through a scanner at that like local polling place. That scanner then has a sort of like summary of vote totals that can be easily compiled and quickly reported upon polls closing. Um, and that is kind of like the initial results that you see. And then some jurisdictions then, if especially if they don't have pre-processing, are going to spend a couple days verifying the eligibility of male voters, opening those envelopes, getting those ballots, and that takes time. And then they have to move on to processing provisional ballots. Those are kind of ballots cast by voters on election day who maybe had an issue with their registration and needed some additional verification. And all of that can take, a period of days or weeks and can make it look like there are like big drops in ballots that are happening after election day. And there are, I mean, I suppose it's possible if, like election administrators do sometimes make mistakes, and maybe there's like a batch of ballots that was on a shelf that didn't initially get tabulated. And I could see that leading to some of these stories of like ballots being found. But that just kind of emphasizes the importance of one, chain of custody. So election officials put a lot of effort into making sure that they're tracking all of the ballots kind of in question at any given time. Every batch or box of ballots is labeled and sealed. So even if they were to have made a mistake and missed processing one box of ballots, it would be accounted for. There's also results aren't final until canvassing and certification. So canvassing is that process after election day where election officials are kind of double checking that their counts are accurate, that all of the numbers line up. And so it's often the case that, or if a mistake has been made, that it is caught during that canvassing process. And that is part of the security of the system that they do that. Because if we only ever relied on the initial count and never double checked it, that would be way more prone to error than this process where we have all of these fail-safe mechanisms built in. And so, when we see coverage of like, oh, ballots being found, I think that is, depending on how you look at it, and evidence of the process working.
That makes sense. We have time for maybe one or two more questions here, but you have that helpful resource on election official turnover from 2000 to 2024. I'm curious what effect the high rate of turnover could have on election outcomes. Do you all sort of study that relationship, and how can journalists cover these concerns without causing, again, more harm or chaos?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Joshua Farrar is a scholar currently at American University. He was previously at UCLA, and he's who we worked with for a lot of this analysis of local election official turnover. And he has done some research to look at whether turnover among local election officials impacts sort of like a wonky term of the residual vote rate. And so essentially like it's a academic way to assess whether there are votes that could not be counted that would otherwise have been counted. And so he finds no significant relationship between turnover among local election officials and that residual vote rate. And so I think that's like some comforting way to see that turnover isn't having a concrete impact on voter turnout. I think that might be a more straightforward way to think about it, of like whether the same number of voters can cast a ballot, and he found that there's no significant relationship. So that would indicate to me that there isn't an impact on election outcomes of turnover. We do find, though, anecdotally and working with election officials, that it can cause administrative strain. It can increase the likelihood of making mistakes, which is just why we need to invest in election administration and give them the resources that they need to do their jobs in the face of adversity and in the face of turnover. And in terms of how to cover it without fueling fear, I always like to fall back on the protections that we do have in place to protect against turnover and other sorts of administrative errors. So looking at the experience levels of election officials, so that 7 years of experience in election administration for most election officials, and then the fact that 80% of new election officials have experience in government already. So there are reasons to think that even when turnover happens, we have protections in place to support new officials.
That's a great way to look at it. One last question here. Someone wants to know what your thoughts are on election observers from the political parties. I know you mentioned some places have, reserved sections for the press, but from parties specifically, or maybe even agitators, influencers, do they influence how disputed votes are counted? And how about the legal teams deployed to states by each political party? Does fear of litigation influence the process?
Mm. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think there's sort of a couple things to think about here. On election observers specifically, there are typically pretty strict rules about election observers not interfering with the vote counting process. There is an intimidation factor of like observers standing there staring down at you while you are like investigating a disputed vote. But generally speaking, my understanding is that observers are restrained from directly interfering. Um, by contrast, it's often the case that when, for example, if you have a ballot where the voter intent isn't clear, like someone had kind of, scribbled in one bubble and then also did a little bit of another one, you're trying to figure out whether to count that race for one candidate or another. Those decisions are typically made by bipartisan teams. And those would be bipartisan teams of like trained poll workers or trained election staff. And so that's one way that we have the kind of, bipartisan validation built into the process as a security tool, again, to prevent against that risk of political interference. And when it comes to kind of the separate question about legal teams deployed to toss-up states by each political party, it certainly is the case that legal teams attempt to look at how ballots are being counted and which ways. But I think that is sort of like an expected part of the process among election officials. There is certainly like an expectation that litigation is going to happen. In my experience working with local election officials is that they are committed to administering trustworthy elections, regardless of what they're going to face. It's like just a part of the culture of what it means to be an election official. And I think the question around like legal teams ultimately impacting outcomes, that raises a bigger question of the reliability of our court system, and I think that's like a bigger question than I can answer. But is when it comes to election administration itself, I trust that election officials are continuing to administer elections in a trustworthy way, regardless of the risk of litigation.
Definitely. Wren, thank you so much for these insights and for answering these wonderful questions. We'll share a link to the recording soon. I know someone was asking about that, along with resources shared during this briefing and more. The National Press Club Journalism Institute is proud to present, programs just like this at no cost to journalists across the U.S. with the mission of powering strong journalism in the public interest. If you'd like to support us in this work, please consider making a donation today. And please spare a few minutes to fill out a survey to tell us how we did today and help us improve our programming. And just a few quick notes on some upcoming programming. We hope you'll join us on May 4th for News Reimagined, the Creator Journalism Summit. It's a half-day event where we will gain tools to meet the moment with journalists, creators, and newsroom leaders who are figuring out the next steps and how to grow audiences, build trust, and make this work sustainable. We also invite you to tune in virtually to our upcoming Career Office Hour on May 5th at 12 p.m. Eastern. We'll hear from editors who hire at business and B2B publications on what they look for in that growing field in candidates. Wren, thank you again. And thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate your active participation. And we'll hopefully see you again soon.
Great. Thanks, everyone.